Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Colin Liddell back on the show. He returns to discuss some current events, recent events, the missile attack, the tomahawk missile attack on the Syrian airfield ordered by President Trump. And he also has penned a couple articles. One is one that's a few years old, but I think it's relevant. It's the gas cloud of Western intervention. How gas warfare or chemical warfare is used as a pretext for Western intervention, and how it was banned after the First World War, despite the fact that a bunch of other horrible weapon platforms were invented. For some reason, that was singled out, and you cover that. And you also talk about this one article about how Syria can win the war against America. Getting into the politics and geopolitics behind this missile attack, this tomahawk missile attack that was ordered. Colin, how are you doing tonight?
Fine, yeah. Thanks for having me on your show again, Tim.
Well, thanks for returning. These articles that you wrote, one was particularly interesting, just the history of it. First, do you want to get into the current events first, or a little background history about poison gas attacks?
Yeah. It's sort of very noticeable how poison gas is being used has a kind of very convenient red line. And, people go on about poison gas being dangerous because it kills people, but actually, in a way, it's more dangerous because of the ease with which it enables certain countries to start and to justify war. And I mean, once you go to war, there's all sorts of terrible weapons that are unleashed. And I mean, we've been seeing this this wonderful new bomb, the Moab bomb, the mother of all bombs, or the I think it's the what's the official acronym for? I think that it means something else as well. But anyway, there's this enormous new bomb that apparently devastates everything within 1 mile, and that's supposed to be less terrible than a whiff of gas. So what we're dealing with here is gas as a means of certain actors in the geopolitical realm inserting red lines into situations to suit their convenience. You could also say the same things about images of dead children. So another thing that we might want to think about is banning images of dead children from the media, because that never seems to end very well.
Yeah, that's always seems to be exploited and it's always they're very selective on the children they pick. We don't see too many Palestinian dead children.
Yes, or Yemeni dead children, or
And I mean, obviously, that brings up to mind the image of the boy that allegedly drowned on the beach during the last year, when the migration crisis was getting a lot of press. And
yes, that reminds me about the recent truck attack in Sweden, where that young girl was basically smeared across the sidewalk like hamburger meat. And that's another image you're not seeing very much of on the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm. Because some victims matter more than others because it serves a political interest. We have the situation, of course, in Syria, where it is alleged that the Assad regime first ordered a chemical attack, and now there's some question of the origin of the attack or what it exactly was. Some people now saying that might have been a weapon or a depot that had been hit by the Assad regime that was controlled by the rebels, which again begs the question. Like,
well, there's lots of possibilities, isn't there? I mean, and of course we don't actually know. I mean, it's even possible that some of these neocon voices are actually right. I mean, I doubt it, but it's not without the realms of possibility. I think the situation with Syria was that, like a lot of countries, Syria developed chemical weapons. There's various reasons to explain or justify that. I mean, basically, if your rival states have those weapons, then you're almost kind of forced to have them as well. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the other countries in the region have the chemical weapons, or in the case of Israel, have even worse weapons, i.e. nuclear weapons. And then when the Syrian civil war developed into this very, very tangled web of chaos, the fact that Syria had these chemical weapons was, of course, a problem, because some of them were falling into the hands of the rebels and some of them were in the hands of government forces. But at the same time, government forces were becoming increasingly decentralized, and there was a kind of general situation of chaos. So you could have, like local commanders who run out of one form of ammunition, resort into chemical weapons as a kind of stopgap solution. And so when there was a large chemical incident in 2013, there was a lot of pressure put on Syria to kind of get rid of its stockpiles of chemical weapons. And I actually think they probably did do that, and they probably got rid of most of their weapons. But it's always possible that in a chaotic situation, not all the weapons are fully accounted for, either on the rebel side or the government side. So it is possible that a local commander used some kind of chemical device for that attack on that village. But that's just one of many possibilities. Of course, the other possibility that's been much talked about is the idea that the Russians seem to favor, which is this was a conventional bombing attack on a rebel base or storage facility, and it just happened to hit their chemical weapon stash. There are, of course, other theories, like it's an obvious false flag which has been perpetrated by, kind of deep state actors or whatever. So, take your pick, as they say.
Yeah, well, it is a civil war going on, and so there's much confusion. Of course, that confusion is contrived because it's this attempt of regime change by the United States and its Gulf state allies and Israel for various reasons. So the mayhem that's created is sort of a planned chaos because they want to destabilize the region. It's part of the Iran-Iran plan, the larger geopolitical plans that goes at least as far back as the George W. Bush administration.
Yeah.
So Trump entered the White House, and he sort of, as he went to the White House, all these intrigues are swirling about. So, so just because, one single election isn't going to change the larger geopolitical agenda that's been, afoot here for at least a decade,
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much it is part of that kind of agenda, because, I think, how many days is it now since Trump launched his cruise missile attack?
A week now?
Yeah, so roughly about a week, isn't it? And there hasn't been much of a follow-up that you would expect to see if that was just like the first salvo.
Yeah.
So I'm more inclined at the moment. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. As we speak, even stuff could be happening. But I'm more inclined to see this as part of his East Asian policy at the moment, and that kind of centers on this this North Korean situation. And I think Trump. Actually, you've got to. I mean, Trump said things in the past about getting involved in Syria with boots on the ground would be stupid. Mm-hmm. I think, even though he's not always the most consistent person, I think he generally believes that it's not a good thing to put lots of U.S. ground forces in there, and that would really be America's Achilles heel. I mean, as I mentioned in my other article. Mm-hmm. How Syria can defeat, or how Syria can win its war against America. And so I think the way it looks looks to me now, 1 week after the initial strike, and with no follow up, is that it's playing into his policy vis-a-vis North Korea, and very famously, this attack took place while he was having dinner with the Chinese president.
Yeah.
And so he's sort of making the point, like, I'm not some guy like Obama who hums and haws and waits for other people to sign up before I lead. I just go out there and I do things, and so therefore I'm unpredictable. I might just do this. So therefore my what I'm thinking or what I'm intending has consequences, and so he's making a power move by doing that. And I think the intended object is the Chinese, of course. He wants the Chinese to kind of do his dirty work with regard to North Korea. He wants them to put the pressure on and to kind of push them into a position where they kind of denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Whether that would work or not is, of course, the big question. But, I meid, there's other things that have happened in recent days which also play into that. The other thing that sort of struck me was this, why did they unleash this new monster bomb just the other day? I think this is the first time they actually dropped this bomb. And it was in the middle of nowhere, basically, in part of Afghanistan, where there is some kind of ISIS affiliate. And I'm pretty sure it didn't really do too much damage to, the ISIS people in the area, but it made a big noise, and it probably caused a lot of damage to the rock strata in that area. But the point of that, again, is to demonstrate, like, if North Korea isn't going to play ball, we've got certain weapons that we can actually use to really mess up their nuclear installations. The purpose of that weapon, I guess, would be some kind of like bunker busting kind of effect. It creates a kind of it's big enough so that it kind of creates a small earthquake. And so anything that the North Koreans are developing, they'll be developing that deep underground in quite strong bunkers. And so I think he's trying to show, look, we've actually got something that could probably, break through your air defenses. And so that fits into the sort of the pattern that Trump's actions are actually mainly aimed at East Asia, and that's kind of interesting and surprising focus in itself, because in many ways North Korea could be a very tough nut to crack. I don't think they would really want to give up their nuclear weapons. Now the other thing about attacking North Korea in this way, even though it has nuclear weapons, that's also very, very interesting, because there is a kind of consensus around the world that, and this is something that basically became very, very solidified during the Obama presidency, that if you have nuclear weapons, the USA will leave you alone. And that's a very, very kind of dangerous idea, for these countries to have, because if people start believing that, and then of course that gives them an enormous impetus to develop nuclear weapons. And right now there is a big question mark over whether Iran is developing nuclear weapons or not. And so if you have somebody like Trump going up against North Korea and saying, like, you have to disarm your nuclear weapons, and we don't care that you have nuclear weapons, we'll still take you on. That sends a very strong message to a country like Iran as well. So the Iranians might think, even if we get nuclear weapons, the Americans aren't going to necessarily leave us alone.
Well, the problem with that is this geopolitical multidimensional chess is that it's just precisely this type of intervention which makes such a mess of things.
Yeah,
I mean, Trump did campaign. He wouldn't be the first presidential candidate to run as, quote, the peace candidate, and then forget his base. I'm going down the list. Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course Eisenhower roughly kept it because he got us out of Korea. But of course, Lyndon Johnson was the peace candidate, right? It's like the joke was, they told me if I voted for Barry Goldwater, we'd be at war the next year. I voted for Barry Goldwater, and we were at war the next year. The old joke back in 1964, 65. And George W. Bush was a peace candidate. He echoed, at least he said similar things that Trump said about America being a normal nation and not intervening. Of course, 9/11 changed everything, and it's just, that's an expensive way to send a message to China. Of course, then it's probably good for the stock of Lockheed Martin, whoever manufactured the Tomahawk missiles. He fired 60 of them or something, and I think at $1.5 million apiece. What's that? Like $90 million right there? To mess up an airfield?
An empty airfield, yes, which was in operation a couple of days later.
So this profligate, bankrupt empire just lobbing missiles there. I imagine he killed somebody. Someone was there.
Apparently, a lot of them were actually shot down. I'm hearing.
Which raises another question: is it because the Russian air defenses that they gave the Syrians are that good, or the missiles they're making are that crappy?
Bits of both, probably.
Yeah. So it's a bit. I mean, trouble because he did say non-intervention, and to me, this type of, like I said, much of the problem in the world, around the world, obviously, all the world's problems can't be attributed to Western intervention, particularly American interventionism. But much of it is because simply they lack the integrity and the wisdom to manage the world properly, and nor I mean, assuming they had the best of intentions. I mean, I mean, this is, we were talking, again, when you're talking about what's been going on in the Middle East for the past several decades, you're talking about, I think, transnational interests, banking interests, Anglo-American banking interests that want to dominate the world, sort of the Kissinger model, the Rockefeller idea of managing the world, through chaos and wars and destabilization, the IMF system of doing things.
Yeah, but I think causing chaos in Northeast Asia. I mean, sort of taking that sort of that approach, which we've seen it play in the Middle East to a large degree, and sort of taking that template and applying it to Northeast Asia, which might be on the cards now. Who knows? That could be very, very interesting, and certainly interesting for me as I live in Japan.
Yes. Now, what's Japan? I mean, Japan's looking at America. America's looking at her foreign policy is more deranged every day, and I mean Japan.
Well, we see this as a form of derangement, but you've got to always look for the method in the madness. I think even if it does turn out to be ultimately madness, before you go there, you've got to try to see if there is actually something going on, and there well could be. I mean, like the North Korean problem, if we refer to it as that, it does affect it affects Japan, obviously, and in a way it also affects China, because North Korea is, of course, usually aligned with China more or less, but if they have their own independent nuclear capability, then they don't actually need to do that quite as much, and if North Korea and China fall out for whatever reason, which is quite possible, because China is, relative to North Korea, kind of liberalizing and becoming more like an inverted commas normal nation, part of the global system, in other words. So that could be a problem for China, because North Korea could end up using those weapons on any one of its neighbors. So it sort of benefits China if North Korea doesn't have those nuclear weapons. So I think they might be in very ambivalent position about that, and they might actually be thinking, wait a minute, if Trump can, go in there and blow the shit out of North Korea's nuclear weapons, then we can pretend to be all angry about that and score a few points over the United States. But at the end of the day, we get a bit of a benefit because we have a former nuclear power on our borders that is no longer a nuclear power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. I mean, that's at a certain level that is true. But I'm looking at the longer range picture, both in history then forward, is that the whole situation on the Korean Peninsula is because of Western, particularly American intervention in Asia. It was, because of this is a blowback from the Second World War, which I think was at least the Pacific War. Between Japan and the United States was provoked by the United States, and Japan itself, as a militarist power, was awakened, by Commodore Perry and showing up and forcing them to modernize. And Japan was the cat's paw of U.S. and British imperialism in Asia for a better part of 3-4 decades. And when they got to independent, they had that's when the United States turned on Japan, and sort of their backdoor to war to get into the war in Europe with. When Roosevelt and his intrigues, arranged for Pearl Harbor. But, there's the whole thing with Vietnam and Korea. That's, both of those wars. One thing, 1950, that's what Dean Acheson said, Korea saved us. It wasn't, it was a provoked crisis. The whole thing was kind of necessary for the whole UN agenda and the American empire. So the American, national security state was sort of, a fledgling bird at that point before it could spread its wings. And the crisis in Europe, the crisis in Asia solidified the Cold War, because until then the Republican Congress was very skittish about signing on to the Truman's agenda, and Korea came along. That's what Dean Acheson in his memoir says, Korea came along and saved us. And of course, this was a few months after he was in the winter of 1950 or 50, winter of 50. He says, Korea's well outside our defense perimeter. The same way that April Glaspie told Saddam Hussein that we have no opinion on your dispute with Kuwait in 1990. So we don't care. And all of a sudden, then of course the invasion occurs. Of course, there's some dispute about that as well. All of a sudden, it's this emergency that has to be policed by the UN, and this sort of creates this precedent where the president can unilaterally, just like Trump just did with Syria, unilaterally order a massive invasion and send an expeditionary force under the guise of the UN, of course. And, so now that was a horrible precedent from the standpoint of, I think, the Constitution here in the United States, because at least prior to that, at least Roosevelt, although he, I think, arranged for Pearl Harbor, at least he still had to ask Congress for a declaration of war. That's the last time we declared war, I think, was 1942.
Yeah, well, that's also part of it, isn't it? Because I think one of the things that one of the points that Trump's making, whether explicitly or implicitly, is that when you have to go through all the correct procedures, and you have to go through Congress, and you have to get other people to sign on board, then it makes the executive much weaker, much more predictable, and so other countries can therefore gain an advantage from that, because they're not constrained in the same way, and so the executive has to have that kind of instantaneous power to react or to do something proactive. And of course, that rides roughshod over the basic principles on which America was founded. But of course, that was a completely different era where war was allowed to gently mature before it was kind of uncorked.
Yeah, that's true to a certain point, I think. But when you look at all the U.S. wars, I strain when I study U.S. history to find a genuinely defensive war. Let's go way back. I mean, it's the War of 1812. I mean, the pretext for that was the impressment issue, what the British Navy was doing. Of course, that was also during the Napoleonic Wars. But and really, if you look into that war deeper into it, what really drove that war was, I guess, territorial ambitions. that certain factions in the U.S. government had towards Canada. And some people even have suggested that war ultimately was fomented by the Rothschilds and banking interests in London because of the failure of the Congress to renew the Bank of the U.S.'s charter in 1811. The war, Mexican War, that was a war of conquest, more or less, just to seize Mexican territory. That really wasn't a defensive war, even if you justify the expansion of the U.S. It certainly wasn't defensive. You have Lincoln's War, the so-called Civil War. That technically wasn't a war, but even that was provoked by Lincoln. The Spanish-American War, sinking of the Maine. You're right. That was, drove that war again was the territorial or the colonies in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific. They were coveted by U.S. financial interests, particularly the banking interests. And also the desire to expand into Asia, which of course would lead us into the Second World War. But then you have Wilson's War, Wilson's taking us to war against Germany in World War I. It was all based on lies, and that wasn't really to make the world safe for democracy or really defend genuine U.S. interests. In the final analysis, Woodrow Wilson was a greater threat to U.S. liberty than the Kaiser, considering the domestic policies that he instituted to prosecute that war. There's more to bail out Wall Street and the British Empire. Of course, that led to the Second World War, and so much for U.S. intervention making the world safe, right? Because it just created the conditions for the Second World War. And then, of course, in prosecuting that war, all types of war atrocity stories, just like in World War I, had to be floated. But they were much, of course, these war atrocity stories were much worse. I think they were floated after the war for the purposes of geopolitical reasons, the whole Holocaust narrative thing. And that's become so established that even to question it now is to threaten imprisonment in some countries. So, it's hard to find a genuine justification for sort of an imperial presidency, necessity for an imperial presidency not having to be hamstrung by Congress or the usual rules of constitutional government.
So it seems like America has to work extra hard to be involved in all these wars because as a country it is naturally isolationist, i.e. it has these two large oceans which basically exist to keep it out of trouble with other parts of the world, and they're not really working quite so well at the moment. But America could get on very well on its own, and it wouldn't really need to be bothered with all these complex geopolitical affairs. I mean, you can't say the same with regard to countries like Russia or China because they're land powers and
continental powers. Yeah,
so they have to really be. I mean, Russia, for example, has to in a way be involved in the Middle East, because it is. Overwhelmingly dependent upon its oil economy, and so that means it's very, very vulnerable to the manipulation of prices on that particular commodity. And so, from the Russian point of view, they want to basically kind of line up their interests with the other oil producers, and the only way they can do that is if they have some kind of agreement or some kind of alliance with those kind of countries, and I think that's what the Russians are. That's why the Russians are involved in the Middle East, and that's their whole kind of motivation for being there. I mean, they've got the Iranians on board, and the Iraqis are kind of like more or less on board, but they can still be countered by the other Gulf states, and so by having their guy in Syria, that gives them a bit more leverage in the Sunni Arab world. Yeah, and they're also, I think the Russians are also quite close to General Sisi in Egypt. So there's an obvious policy that the Russians are following, which is to kind of be seen as the good guy in the Middle East, and I think they are trying to kind of like say, we're the middleman between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and we want everybody to basically win, and we're all kind of like we're all connected to the oil industry, and if we line up our interests and we create a kind of power of monopoly or cartel, then we're all going to do well out of it. And so don't let the Americans and the Israelis come in and divide us up. That's the basic line that they're trying to sell. Mm-hmm. And of course, the West is not entirely too happy about that for various reasons. It really it could really blow away the whole basis of the petrodollar if the Russians became too ascendant in that particular area of the world. So I think there are those kinds of vested interests that the Russians have. Now the Americans, you could say the Americans have certain economic vested interests, but they're not really that as vital to America as those interests are to Russia, I think.
Yeah. No, I think what it is, well, I mean, the thing is that sort of level or depth of analysis isn't what's retailed to the public regarding. It's always a moralistic fairy tale. Assad has to go. He's an evil dictator. So the public and the political process addresses this cartoonish moralistic fairy tale. Where evil dictators have to go. Saddam Hussein's Hitler. Gaddafi's a madman of North Africa. These things, and there's no analysis of this petrodollar. The idea of a China, Russia, Europe condominium challenging the Atlanticist powers and these stuff. If you put it in those terms, then at least we're getting down to brass tacks. Now we're dealing with power politics, sort of this mercantilist conflict here. Instead of this, let's dispense with the moralism at least. Let's talk like adults about this stuff, because if it's to defend the petrodollar, what's the basis of the petrodollar? It's the Pentagon, and it's the missiles and the submarines, because there's because ever since the dollar was cut loose from gold, and the American economy was subsequently deindustrialized, there's very little productivity to back the U.S. dollar, which is still dominant in trade because of the Pentagon.
Yeah, that's why I actually think that Putin and the Iranians and Hezbollah and all those kind of people are aligned. They actually should be pushing for a gradual escalation, and they should be pushing to kind of draw America in more and more. Because it is the more America gets sucked in, I think the more America will become weaker and will actually lose. Now, if you allow America to stay offshore and to bomb what the fuck they like, that keeps America in this kind of like this position of kind of hegemonic dominance. The paper tiger remains intact, and so if you can just like bring that paper tiger into the kind of the mucky world of ground warfare in the Middle East more and more, then we saw what happened last time. When that happened in Iraq, America became this incredibly war-weary nation, and it also became completely detested by Europe, which is the other main pillar of this kind of global dominance that they project through NATO. And things got so bad that they had to bring in this guy Obama to kind of like paper over the cracks.
Yeah, and this is another thing. Again, you mentioned Europe, because I think much of the destabilization we're seeing in in countries like Libya and Syria is an indirect attack on Europe and the euro to prop up the dollar, because the migration crisis, this destabilized the euro. You also have the exposure, the Greek debt, which was set up by Goldman Sachs. And of course, and all the European banks that had bought the Greek debt because of Goldman Sachs had cooked the books so they could get into the Maastricht Treaty. So it's complete fraud. It's set up, but a lot of this is just a bluff, because it's the whole banking system is a confidence racket. There's no fundamentals behind it. It's all psychological, and so you can create crises here and there, which is probably what they look for. It's why they like the fractional reserve banking system, because they can foment a crisis at a key point, and and create a crisis, and they can pump and dump, and then return, come back in and buy everything for a song. But at the same time, if you look at at key points, whenever there's a problem in Europe, it's when the dollar's being challenged. So you get a migration crisis. You get you get this thing, this whole thing with largely the geopolitics challenging Russia. In Russia's near abroad, we're talking Ukraine here, and you have Victoria Nuland, who's handpicking the Ukrainian, prime minister or president or wherever. And she's we have these Soros-backed NGOs that are now they've been caught, taxing in refugees into Europe. These to destabilize Europe. At the same time, they're over.
Well, yeah, it does. It does destabilize Europe because it creates, this kind of groundswell for people like Marine Le Pen who actually want to break up the EU, and so personally, I think it's actually a necessary thing because I think there is a case for some kind of European Union, but obviously not in its present horribly toxic form.
How do you get Germany and Greece to be have the same currency? That's absurd. Two completely different cultures. One's big on savings, wary of fearful of inflation for historical reasons. Highly productive.
For honesty in all things, I think they should just rename it the Fourth Reich, in its present form. It's just a device for keeping this latest incarnation of the Deutschmark from over-appreciating.
Yeah. But there's that's how they were sold on it. Or was it I guess there were. I think it was Helmut Kohl. Was it Helmut Kohl was told this would allow for German dominance of the continent, and he signed on to it. But I think there's another. A deeper level to this again because we're talking about the central bankers of the world and the few people that control these things and the debt because obviously someone like Merkel who seems to be an agent of the Anglican power of the Anglo-American Zio powers because she seems to be so determined to bring in all these refugees and destroy Germany as what it remains of a sort of an ethno-state. She wants to, and this goes back to a larger plan that that Wesley Clark has talked about, that Sutherland Peter Sutherland has talked about destroying the ethnic foundation for the European states, to break up of the European states, and some have speculated this whole thing. The whole crisis, this immigration crisis, is an attempt to create a European identity as a part of the dialectic, because the reaction to it, because now we must defend European civilization, and
it's really hard to see which way it. I mean, whichever theory you have, there is some evidence to support it. I mean, there's a growing feeling of European nationalism, but at the same time. There's not nearly enough yet, and so you could either say that Europe will wake up and it will reassert itself, or it will wake up too late and it'll be half Muslim by then, and who knows what will happen, civil war, or it'll just become like that Holobeck novel, Submission.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it's because they've been demoralized for so long. They've been under psychological warfare for decades since. Well, I'd say go back World War I, but particularly since World War II, with the pessimism, the nihilism, so existentialism, like in France, which I guess caught on after World War I because of the horrible losses that they took, but particularly after World War II, with the declining birth rates, and so then you have this demographic problem.
I mean the decline in birth rates, that was just basically that just sprang out of certain technological and social innovations which had not been anticipated, and because of that you need to have something that is consciously countering that, and so people have to become much more racially aware, much more aware of demographics and birth rates and the role of women, and all that has to be put into a much more conscious and political. All that has to be put much more on the kind of conscious political side, whereas before women having enough babies was just taken for granted.
Yeah, that's right. This is the cultural war. Defending that, you have to defend the natural and obvious.
Yeah, so these political developments, they're there to kind of offset these deficiencies that arise from the social system, or from the negative effects of new technologies, or for economic problems. And so, yeah, I think all these things are not really natural to us yet. I mean, people are a lot less nationalistic. They're a lot less tribal than they need to be, because a lot of their kind of impulses to survive as a group just grew out of their natural situation, and that natural situation has now changed, and so because of that, they're effectively dying, and so they've got to develop a new political way of thinking, a new ideology that counters all these forces.
But it's hard to do that without being accused of being a Nazi, though. Right?
Yeah, well, that's just one of the things that we have to overcome.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously the ethnic foundation for community is one of I think the most solid foundation for community. Ethno-religious, right? Ethno-religious is if you want to support community, people will say you hear the word community a lot. It doesn't mean anything anymore, because without
communities used to just be organic. They just used to happen naturally.
Yeah.
People didn't have social media to avoid their neighbors through, or cable TV to sort of isolate themselves in their own little bubble, and so all these things used to be organic. Women having enough children, it just naturally, organically happened. Communities forming naturally, organically happened. People organizing against invaders, or however they came. Mm-hmm. That was just a natural thing. But we've created a kind of society and environment where all these things are nurtured in various ways, and often I don't think it's some great conspiracy like a lot of people are inclined to believe. I mean, I actually do endorse conspiracy thinking, because I think that's a kind of emotional way that people can get to the point where they kind of assert the right kind of political ideas that they need to survive. Even though it's based on paranoia, that kind of paranoia can be very, very healthy.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. We shouldn't oversimplify these things. Not everything is a result of or a product of a conspiracy. It's not as if David Rockefeller or George Soros are personally planning the programming on MTV to get to our kids, corrupt our kids. It's not that simple. But society has its own momentum, culture has its own momentum and timing, I guess. But nevertheless, there are prime movers, and the evidence does suggest of certain high-level malfeasance, well-organized high-level malfeasance, looking to fundamentally change or degrade the culture, if you will, through mass programming, entertainment, education, and such. That goes way back even to the Rockefellers or the General Education Board and Frederick T. Gates, looking to keep society dumbed down so they have workers, not thinkers. But more recently, in 1969, Planned Parenthood was commissioned by the federal government. They had a meeting, I think it was just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and according to some of the notes or minutes that were taken, what was discussed there wasn't recorded, but according to the notes, what was discussed there was a concerted effort by Planned Parenthood and other agencies and I guess organizations to promote family breakup through promoting divorce, and we got no-fault divorce, through the promotion of sexual liberation, perhaps, or sexual freedom, as they call it, and the promotion of homosexuality. How do you promote homosexuality? Well, you can do it by creating a toxic culture through the media and through making sure, if you create a situation where more families are broken up or never formed, children are much more vulnerable to being abused and trauma, and this creates much higher rates of dysfunction, including sexual dysfunctions. And it appears that this was sort of scientifically planned out. You also have, with now you have to ask yourself why were certain figures promoted. Why was Gloria Steinem made a celebrity? When, of course, she has her pedigree goes right back to the CIA. Why does everyone know who Allen Ginsberg was? Why was Alfred Kinsey and his dubious and also criminal research promoted? to promote a certain cultural agenda, legitimized to create the academic support for the sexual revolution that would be promoted in the ensuing decade through entertainment and music. And you have, Time Life magazine that's promoting psychedelic drug use a decade before the Summer of Love, 1967. And just more recently, of course, we had, if you look at the AIDS crisis or AIDS scare of the 1980s, that was used as a pretext to implement sex ed programs and to expose kids to graphic sex ed education programs. That was written up in the, I think it was the National Research Council. I think it was the report. They said that the whole purpose of the sex ed programs wasn't there to protect kids' health. It was done on the cover of a public health measure. It was there to fundamentally change younger students' sexual values and mores and attitudes. And they used the public health measure was just a cover, because they realized with the fear of AIDS, they could get away with these things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get away with, because there'd be too much resistance on the part of parents. And so you do have that high level. Again, there's evidence that this stuff is being orchestrated or planned out. Not everything is controlled, but the cultural mandarins are in a position to promote certain ideas, memes, and values through entertainment, through advertising, and directly into the school system, particularly through the public school system. So I don't think it's quite as, I don't think it was spontaneous as it was laid out to be. I think it was much more controlled than most people care to believe.
It was a kind of trickle-down effect, though, because I think the upper classes had these things a lot earlier than the masses.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think the upper classes were sort of going through this process more or less in the late 19th century. And then by the time we get to the 1960s, it started to trickle down to everybody else.
But here in the States, a good example is it's no coincidence that, right after during the Second World War and right after the Second World War, that there was a concerted and planned effort, a program to break up the ethnic neighborhoods under the pretext of urban renewal and racial integration. And the whole purpose of racial integration was not racial integration. It was actually to create white flight and to create the diaspora into the suburbs. At the same time, the federal government was implementing things like the Federal Housing Administration, the 30-year mortgage, to get the ethnic whites into the suburbs, where the idea was for them to lose their ethnic identity, particularly the Catholics who had high birth rates, and this was part of the WASP elite, who looked askance at the growing Catholic power in America, and of course this was signified in the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. So they were very worried about that. At the same time, for the better part of 40 years, because of Catholic power in the United States, they were able to impose a production code in Hollywood. So the Jewish moguls in Hollywood were very happy to see the Catholic power weaken in the United States, because with that they could now break the production code and then make the movies they wanted to make. And this was key in I think creating the social conditions not only for the sexual revolution, but also for the development of a kind of a deracinated white middle class addicted to consumerism and ultimately to debt.
It's often a case of which one is the cart and which one is the horse, because a lot of these trends, also you could say that they just follow from the economic logic, where you're trying to stimulate the economy, and one way to do that is to develop the suburbs. Another way is to get women into the workforce to decrease the dependency ratio. Things like that all has all those things have a very strong economic effect as well, and therefore that kind of like brings in all these kind of cultural forces. And so which one is first? It's a chicken or egg situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's which was first.
Two things go hand in hand.
Yeah,
it's not really sure. It's not really clear which one is the cause and which one is the effect.
But the idea of get back to kind of weaponized migration. the sort of psychological warfare that is involved in that. I mean, we saw that example here in the United States. Again, I mentioned the integration, the shipping of black sharecroppers north into the cities during during the Second World War to create, because of the labor shortage created by the Second World War. Now, that was one aspect of it. Another aspect was the industry liked it because they brought in all this labor to weaken the labor unions. And they, good example, in Detroit, I think it was Detroit, where they shipped in all these black sharecroppers from the South to work in the factories and dumped them in the middle of a Polish neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Then were shocked that there was problems. Well, they expected the problems. They wanted the problems. And in the 1960s, it was exposed in the 1960s that the Health Education Welfare Department of Health Education Welfare had given $900,000 to this black gang called the Blackstone Rangers. And it was part of these community block grants and all that. Now, people write it off as government, waste and incompetence, but the intention there was to create white flight, to terrorize the white ethnics and make them sell their houses fast and go into the suburbs. So, and this is why I'm saying this is very similar to the gangs like in the Ukraine that the NGOs pay for, or ISIS, which is backed by the Gulf states and operating out of NATO. They're kind of designed to go in and to create mayhem, to create the instability, and then you can profit off the instability.
They definitely don't want everybody just to kind of settle down and have nice, peaceful lives, because once you get a nice neighborhood, you've got your own house going, you've got your family going, then you just want to sit back and enjoy life, and you don't want to work too hard. And if you get enough people doing that on a large enough scale, think of the enormous downturn in the economy that actually creates, because people are less agitated, they're less worried, they're less driven by the need to relocate somewhere or get money to buy a new house in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And so it would destroy the entire global economy. So you need to keep people on their toes. So that's one way to do it. You import blacks into a Polish neighborhood back in the 1960s or whenever that was.
Yeah, 40s.
Yeah, 40s. And you see the same thing in Europe. I mean, why? What is the? I mean, you could go into the geopolitics of the Middle East, but why bother? You've got to look at it in a more kind of macro empirical way. What does bringing all these young, mainly male, military age Muslim guys into Europe do? It puts everybody on edge.
Yeah.
Your safety zone no longer exists. Therefore, you think, oh God, I've got to move, or I've got to get more money, or I've got to do this, or I've got to do that. You know what I mean? So you actually see it as a kind of weird and very, very perverted economic driver.
Well, it's sort of Naomi Klein. I don't agree with everything she says, but her general idea of the shock doctrine, I kind of agree with the idea that whether it's through wars or economic calamities, and it's almost like the system is set up that they can trigger an economic calamity when they want it, or they can trigger a war when they want it, and that's what's going way back. Are you familiar with the Reese Committee of the 50s and investigating the foundations? And here in the United States, they're investigating some of the tax-free foundations, and then it was suspected that they were supporting communism. But the thing was, communism was only one level. Communism was a controlled thing. It was to create that fear, to manage a crisis, to create the Cold War, so you would have that conflict that would justify the immense defense budgets and the amounting debt that the system relies on. The system relies on debt. The money is based on debt. The whole thing is based on debt.
And debt is based on emotion.
Yeah. And it was Norman Dodd was the chief investigator. The Reese Committee was a congressional committee investigating this, and this was the some of the ideas or causes that the foundations were supporting. These tax-free foundations were supporting communism or radical causes, And then it was more done because they thought it might be communist, but there was something else going on here. And Norman Dodd sent a young lady, Catherine Casey, up to investigate read through the minutes of the Carnegie Foundation for Peace. And now what happened was, for some reason or other, they let her see everything. Okay? And maybe a fit of absent-mindedness or just sort of a revelation of the method, I don't know. But what she uncovered was that as far back as 1909, the Carnegie Foundation was talking about how do we fundamentally change the United States. It's too independent. It's too decentralized. How do we change it? And the best way to change it, we found, was to subject it to a series of crises, particularly wars. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, the 20th century, right? And so, in fact, what she found in these minutes, when she read in these minutes, it was such a shock to her, a blow to her worldview, that she had a nervous breakdown and could never live a normal life anymore, because she was, a lawyer, well educated. She believed in the system, the American system, and she found out that some of the most powerful families and foundations were dedicated to a long-term plan to fundamentally collectivize the country by using a series of crises. And all the wars that she had read about and experienced and lived through wasn't what she thought it was.
Yeah. You can't let the working class get too organized or cozy.
Yes.
You basically got to keep them fretting and moving from pillar to post and running around in circles so that the economy can thrive.
Yeah, and you get people like if you get figures like Edward Bernays, he's just one man, but he kind of reflects this. He's the one devising governmental policy, advertising. This sort of this. And people like B.F. Skinner and behaviorism, and this shapes our schooling system, and how we're educated and what we think of ourselves, and I just interviewed Dr. Joseph Farrell talking about Common Core, and he was studying Common Core. He found out that going back, the electronic testing service, the whole system of standardized testing, they worked with the Human Ecology Fund, which links it to MK Ultra. So, I mean, this is Harvard University. Now, the whole idea was to gather mass data on people so they can be classified and monitored. And that's his thesis. This is what Common Core is all about, and not just dumbing everything down. That's a side issue. The big issue is it's that just through standardized testing they can monitor everybody. At times, it's hard to believe that a plan like this could be so well thought out and detailed.
Well, I don't think it is. I think it's a number of processes which go in the direction dictated by the dynamic of economics, which is always to try to increase in some way, to increase economic activity in various ways. And there are sort of countervailing forces that push against that. I mean, people generally don't want to be running around 24/7, working themselves into an early grave, and so there's those natural human instincts to just take it easy and to do enough and no more, and that works against these kind of economic forces, and these economic forces to get around that basic inertia of human nature. It sort of develops all these weird systems, and I think the process is not done entirely. I mean, some people are conscious of parts of it, or they're more conscious of other parts of it than other people are. But generally speaking, I think it's a largely unconscious or semi-conscious kind of process, and it's just that we don't actually understand how we're being manipulated by these economic forces and our own human psychology and our own failings as a society. We lack a kind of awareness of how the world works, and so we get pushed along in these directions that we're not really choosing ourselves. So that we kind of lack agency. We lack a sense of will, a sense of consciousness.